Hamish Macbeth leaned against the weathered stone wall of the quiet courtyard, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. The village of Lochdu, still hushed from the lingering fog, seemed almost to hold its breath, as if aware that something was very wrong. From his vantage point, the crime scene was deceptively ordinary, an abandoned drawing room in the oldest wing of Muirfield House, but the sense of unease that prickled at the back of his neck told him this was no simple domestic mishap. The door to the room had been locked from the inside, and yet the household staff swore no one had been inside since the previous evening. Mrs. Maclean, the housekeeper, wrung her hands in her usual fussing manner, whispering about the oddity of it all. It's just not possible, Mr. Macbeth," she said, her voice trembling. "No windows open, no doors broken. And yet, there." She nodded toward the polished parquet floor where, almost inconspicuously, lay the body of Andrew Bannerman, the young heir of the estate, his expression frozen in an unnatural calm, a faint, polite smile still clinging to his lips. Hamish crouched, his eyes narrowing on the body. The scene was absurdly neat. Nothing had been overturned, no signs of struggle, not even a drop of blood outside the immediate vicinity. The police inspector had arrived, flustered, looking like a man perpetually on the edge of exasperation, muttering about the impossibility of it all. But Hamish knew that it was never impossibility that mattered, only that someone had overlooked the simplest detail, the one that would unravel the entire puzzle. His eyes caught the clue, a single playing card, face up, resting delicately on the mantelpiece. The Queen of Hearts. Too deliberate, too conspicuous to be accidental, yet its meaning was entirely opaque. No one in the household admitted to touching it, and no correspondence or papers in the room hinted at any card games or rituals. It was as if the card had been left precisely to mock whoever might find it, a gentle taunt, polite almost in its audacity. Hamish felt the familiar tug of intrigue, the kind that had drawn him into countless other unsolvable cases. He stood pacing slowly, observing the room with the patience of a cat stalking its prey. The locked door, the meticulous arrangement of furniture, the eerie calm of the body, the incongruous playing card. Each piece seemed to contradict the others, forming a pattern too complex to be coincidental, too simple to be anything but deliberate. He asked himself the question he always asked when confronted with baffling situations: who benefits from a crime executed so perfectly it nearly invites disbelief? As he wandered around the room, he noticed the faintest trace of dust disturbed near the fireplace, almost imperceptible against the otherwise spotless floor. He crouched again, letting the dim morning light illuminate the subtle disruption. Something or someone had passed through here, but carefully, almost reverently, as if the act itself was ceremonial. The meticulousness unsettled him, but it also confirmed that this was no spur-of-the-moment crime. This was planned, and with remarkable precision. Hamish straightened, running a hand through his unruly hair. Outside, the wind sighed through the tall fir trees that surrounded Muirfield House, carrying with it the chill of the loch. The villagers, gossiping and whispering in the streets below, had already begun crafting their own theories: robbery gone wrong, revenge, even a jealous lover. But Hamish knew better than to trust the seductive simplicity of appearances. Every detail in this room spoke of patience, restraint, and a careful orchestration meant to baffle. And mislead. He paused by the window, peering out at the manicured grounds, noting the absence of footprints or disturbances in the frost-laden grass. Whoever had committed this crime had left nothing but a silent, polite taunt behind. Macbeth felt that peculiar mix of irritation and excitement that came when a case teased him, like a cat playing with a mouse. Only the mouse had no obvious fear, and the game seemed far too polite for such deadly consequences. Returning his gaze to the body and the lone playing card, Hamish allowed a slow smile to curl at the corners of his mouth. There was a rhythm here, a hidden message beneath the outward calm, and he would find it. Every baffling clue, every seemingly meaningless detail would eventually reveal its purpose. This was the kind of crime that could drive a lesser man to despair, or, if handled with care and cunning, could become a masterclass in deduction. And Hamish Macbeth, of all people, had the patience and the insight to unravel a murder too polite to notice. He inhaled the crisp air again, steadying himself, and whispered softly, more to himself than anyone else, Let's see what you're trying to tell me, Andrew Bannerman. Let's see what secrets you left behind." Then, with deliberate calm, he began the careful, meticulous work of examining the scene, knowing that each subtle clue would lead him deeper into the heart of a mystery designed to confound anyone who dared underestimate it. Hamish Macbeth moved carefully among the polished furniture, his eyes scanning the room with the unhurried intensity of someone who knew that the smallest detail could unravel the entire facade. The inspector bustled about, clipboard in hand, barking orders to his officers as they measured the room, dusted for fingerprints, and catalogued the obvious. But Hamish had learned long ago the obvious rarely mattered. It was the overloo. Ked, the incidental, the almost invisible, that held the truth. His gaze fell on the mantelpiece once more. The Queen of Hearts remained in its place, almost imperiously commanding attention, but beneath it, a faint smudge caught his eye, a streak of ash slightly darker than the rest of the hearth. Someone had touched the edge of the fireplace, perhaps to steady themselves, perhaps to conceal a step, yet the pressure of their hand had left this subtle trace. He crouched and gently pressed a fingertip to it, noting the texture, a mixture of soot and powder, not quite like the ordinary fireplace ash, more deliberate in its placement. As he straightened, his attention shifted to the rug beneath Andrew Bannerman's body. It was a thick Persian weave, one that would normally betray even the faintest footprint. And yet the body's position had somehow left the weave untouched, not a single depression from a foot or knee except where Andrew himself had fallen. That was impossible without careful planning, or a third party who knew exactly how to manipulate the weight distribution. Hamish made a mental note. The killer had been meticulous, yes, but also confident, bold enough to assume that no one would notice the unnatural perfection of their work. The household staff, meanwhile, had begun to gather in the doorway, murmuring anxiously among themselves. Hamish's eyes caught Mrs. Mac lean again, her fingers twisting the lace of her apron in a way that betrayed more than grief. There was hesitation in her stance, a slight faltering in her account of the night's events. I didn't see anything, Mr. Macbeth. I only heard a noise when I went to check on Mr. Bannerman," she stammered, her voice too even, too rehearsed. Hamish inclined his head slightly, not interrupting her, letting her words settle. It was the pause between syllables, the carefully measured cadence that spoke. Louder than any testimony, he turned then to the desk, a solid oak piece with drawers that gleamed despite the morning gloom. Papers had been shuffled, though not carelessly. Some letters were slightly askew, and one envelope, notably, had been pushed to the very edge of the desk, nearly falling off. Inside, a faint scent of lavender lingered, incongruous amidst the mustiness of the old estate. Hamish frowned. The scent was not strong enough to have been deliberately applied as a distraction. It was incidental, an unintentional signature. Whoever had been here had brushed against something, carried the odour unknowingly, and left it behind as a trace. He allowed his eyes to drift to the window. Frost glimmered on the panes, but a single streak of condensation traced a downward path where someone had leaned too close to peer outside. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone without a trained eye, but to Hamish it was a whisper from the past hour, a silent testimony that contradicted the notion of a locked room. Someone had approached the window, perhaps seeking a vantage point or ensuring their escape route remained clear. The question was whether they had entered and exited in a conventional manner, or if the very idea of conventional entry and exit had been cleverly subverted. The inspector approached, peering over Hamish's shoulder, clearly eager for confirmation that the routine procedures were sufficient. "Found anything unusual, Macbeth?" he asked, voice tinged with impatience. Hamish shook his head slightly, smiling faintly. "Everything is unusual," he said softly, almost to himself, "but some of it more quietly than you might think." A sudden noise drew his attention to the corner of the room, where a small brass inkwell had been knocked askew, leaving a tiny ring of ink on the desk. It was not enough to be noticed at first glance, but it suggested movement. Someone bending or reaching in a manner inconsistent with casual activity. Hamish crouched, noting the angle of the inkwell and the faint smudge of ink on the edge of the paper nearest it. The motion had been precise, careful, deliberate, but not flawless. A human element, small and almost imperceptible, had revealed itself amidst the perfection of the staged scene. Hamish allowed himself a slow breath, stepping back and taking in the room as a whole. The body, the card, the soot, the scent of lavender, the condensation, the ink smudge, the tiny falter in Mrs. Maclean's composure. They all formed a web, intricate and delicate, and he could feel the first threads of deception beginning to twist. Someone had tried to craft a murder too polite to notice, but politeness could not erase the instincts of observation or the subtle betrayals of human error. He straightened, glancing once more at the assembled staff and the busy inspector. Somewhere, hidden beneath this facade of order and propriety, the truth waited, quietly daring him to uncover it. Hamish felt the familiar thrill, that quiet certainty that the answer would come not from force or conjecture, but from patience, attention, and a willingness to notice what everyone else ignored. The game had begun, and already the first signs of deception were showing themselves in the faintest, most telling ways. Hamish Macbeth stepped away from the drawing room, letting the inspector take over the routine cataloguing of evidence. He had learned that the truth rarely revealed itself in isolation. It was in the interplay of words, in the subtle hesitations and emphases of those who had something to hide, or something to protect. The household had assembled in the grand hall, each face a mask carefully chosen for the occasion: grief, shock, polite concern. Hamish's gaze swept over them with the quiet precision of a man accustomed to reading people like open books. He began with Mrs. Maclean, the housekeeper whose earlier nervousness had caught his attention. "Tell me again what you heard last night," he said gently, his tone more coaxing than commanding. She recited her story, hands pressed tightly together, the sound of a muffled thump. Her hesitancy before entering Andrew's room, and the discovery of his body. Her words were measured, almost rehearsed, and yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, uncertainty perhaps, or fear of a consequence she had not fully articulated. Hamish noted the inconsistency. She claimed to have checked the room immediately upon hearing the noise, yet the faint smear of soot on the fireplace suggested she had leaned in carefully, inspecting something more closely than her account allowed. Next he turned to Andrew's cousin, Fiona Bannerman, who had arrived shortly after the household discovered the body. She seemed almost eager to speak, her voice animated, as though the act of recounting events gave her a sense of control. "I was in the library, of course," she said, reading, as usual. "I heard nothing until the commotion, and then I ran to the room as quickly as I could." Her eagerness was too pronounced, her gestures too precise. Hamish noticed a subtle tremor in her hands, the sort of nervous energy that betrayed someone trying to convince both herself and her listeners. When he asked whether she had noticed anyone else in the corridors, her answer was immediate, almost offensive: no, no one. It was perfectly quiet. That certainty, too smooth, made him pause. Humans rarely experience perfect quiet. Someone had either been careful or lying. Hamish's attention shifted to a footman, young and awkward, who avoided eye contact as he described his night. I was in the kitchen preparing things for breakfast," he mumbled, voice low, hands twisting at tea. The hem of his uniform. "I didn't see anything, I swear." Yet Hamish caught the slight redness around the boy's eyes, the telltale sign of sleeplessness, perhaps guilt, or fear of reprimand. Small inconsistencies emerged as the questions continued. The footman had been in the kitchen at the time Fiona claimed to be in the library. Both could not be entirely truthful about the timing of events. Even the inspector, officious and confident, seemed unprepared for the subtle interplay of deception Hamish had begun to discern. He nodded as the various statements rolled in, relying on the standard forms, the expected sequence of testimony, unaware that each word, each pause, offered a clue to the trained observer. Hamish noted a pattern forming. Some were too eager to offer information, others too cautious, and a few carefully omitted details that might, if revealed, point a finger in the wrong or right direction. As he listened, Hamish's mind worked quietly, fitting together fragments. The Queen of Hearts, the soot on the fireplace, the faint scent of lavender, the condensation on the window. These were all physical traces, yet here were the human traces: hesitation, over-eagerness, subtle inconsistencies. One could almost see the web of intentions and secrets forming. each person an active thread in the intricate design of the crime. He returned to Mrs. Maclean briefly, probing gently, asking about the placement of the card. Her hands shook slightly this time, and a soft flush coloured her cheeks. I didn't touch it," she said, voice low. "I swear." But the tremor in her fingers betrayed her, as did the careful avoidance of his gaze. Hamish filed the detail away, aware that this was not a confession but a breadcrumb, perhaps leading him closer to the full picture. Eadside, the wind moaned through the tall firs surrounding Muirfield House, carrying with it the chill of the L. Oh! The villagers' gossip had begun to trickle in, adding noise but little clarity. Hamish ignored it, focusing on the voices in the room. Each witness offered a version of reality, each subtly coloured by their motives and fears. He had seen enough to know that the murderer's careful politeness extended not just to the crime itself, but to the performances that followed. Someone had rehearsed their grief, their concern, their oblivion, too neat, too exact to be accidental. By the time the questioning drew to a close, Hamish had a sense of the threads tugging against one another, faint and invisible to anyone else, but undeniable to him. Deception had settled over Muirfield House like a fine mist, each person hiding something, each detail a potential key. The murderer was among them, embedded in plain sight, relying on the assumption that politeness and precision would mask their guilt. Hamish Macbeth, however, had learned long ago that even the most polite crime leaves a whisper, a slip, a trace, and he intended to follow each one to its source. Hamish Macbeth returned to the drawing room once the witnesses had dispersed, the echoes of their voices lingering like faint shadows against the polished wood. He paced slowly, allowing his mind to retrace each story, each subtle hesitation, each overemphasis he had observed. Motives, he knew, were rarely as neat as the physical clues. They were messy, overlapping, and often contradictory. In Muirfield House he could feel the tangled threads of desire, fear, and resentment stretching between each person in the room, and he began to map them out, quietly, in the way he did best. Andrew Bannerman had been a young man of some fortune, inheriting the estate after the death of his father just 2 years prior. His position made him the object of envy, admiration, and occasional bitterness. Fiona Bannerman's eagerness to recount her evening now made sense when viewed through that lens. She had always been close to the inheritance, and subtle remarks over the years had hinted at her belief that she should have a larger role in the family fortune. Her insistence that she had been elsewhere, her defensive precision, Hamish noted, might well be shielding a motive stronger than mere concern. Mrs. Maclean, the housekeeper, presented another layer. She had been with the family for decades, her loyalty almost a reflex, yet she had also been privy to the private dealings of the household. The tremor in her hands, the avoidance of his gaze when he asked about the card, hinted at an anxiety that went beyond grief. Perhaps it was fear of responsibility, or fear of what knowledge she held, but there was also the possibility of a protective instinct, a desire to shield someone else from suspicion. Motive was rarely straightforward. Sometimes it hid behind the guise of selfless concern. He, footman, young and nervous, had fewer apparent stakes, yet that too required careful consideration. Youthful fear could be a powerful motivator, or a weapon in the hands of someone more calculating. Hamish recalled the slight redness around his eyes and the sleepless tension in his body. There was more than mere accident in that exhaustion, he suspected. The boy had been aware of something, or someone, he was reluctant to disclose. Perhaps he had been used as a messenger, or perhaps he had witnessed a moment that now weighed heavily on him. Hamish's mind returned to the Queen of Hearts, perched with deliberate attention on the mantel. Its symbolism was difficult to ignore. Hearts, love, passion, rivalry. Was it a personal message, a mark of irony, or a red herring designed to amuse the perpetrator at the expense of those investigating? Whatever its purpose, it was tied to motive, to intention, and to the character of the son who had left it there. Hamlet had the sense of a mind trying to communicate a hidden story, one carefully cloaked in the language of games and symbols. He began to cross-reference the alibis, noting the contradictions that had surfaced during questioning. Fiona claimed to be in the library, yet her footsteps, or those of someone moving near her purported location, had left no trace. Mrs. Maclean's timing was inconsistent with the faint smudge of soot on the fireplace. The footman's claimed absence from the corridors conflicted with Fiona's account of the library being undisturbed. Each inconsistency was small, almost dismissible, yet when considered together they formed a latticework of uncertainty, each strand tugging against the next. Greed, jealousy, fear, and the weight of personal history intertwined in this household like tangled vines. Andrew's polite, almost serene demeanour in life had belied the tensions simmering around him. His death now exposed those tensions, allowing motives that had long lain dormant to rise to the surface. Hamish could see the invisible lines connecting each person to the victim: Fiona's desire for influence, Mrs. Maclean's protective secrecy, the footman's unspoken knowledge. And yet none of these alone could account for the precision of the crime, the careful staging, the deliberate misdirection. H paused at the window, looking out at the frost-laden grounds of the estate, each path, each track, each shadow seeming to mirror the complexity he was now untangling inside. The murderer had acted with thought and care, but human motivation, unlike a perfectly laid plan, rarely adhered to a single line of reasoning. There would be layers, fear masked as loyalty, envy hidden under politeness, perhaps even love twisted into something darker. Hamish knew the next step was not merely to look at what was done, but why it had been done, to try. See the invisible web of desire and resentment that bound this household together and led to murder. He returned to the body, to the subtle clues, the card, the smudges, the scent of lavender lingering faintly in the air, and felt the first solid sense of direction emerging from the chaos. Each thread of motive, each hesitation, each contradiction, formed a pattern that, if followed patiently, could reveal not just who had acted, but why. Somewhere within Muirfield House, beneath the veneer of politeness and propriety, the heart of the crime beat quietly, and Hamish Macbeth, with his slow, careful attention, would find it. Hamish Macbeth lingered in the drawing-room long after the last witness had left, the silence stretching around him like a taut thread. It was then that one of the junior constables, eager to impress the inspector, approached with a small, leather-bound notebook. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "we found this tucked behind the desk. It has Andrew's handwriting, some notes about money transfers and debts, and this line about Fiona asking for an advance on her inheritance." The inspector's eyes lit up immediately. "Well, that's it, then," he exclaimed, stamping a heavy hand on the edge of the desk. Motive established. Case closed. Hamish, however, allowed only the faintest twitch of a smile. He had seen this before. The rush to tidy a messy puzzle into neat, decisive conclusions. The notes were indeed suspicious, hinting at financial tensions between Andrew and Fiona, but something about the manner of their discovery, the casual, almost theatrical way they were found, felt too convenient. He crouched, examining the corner of the desk where the notebook had been retrieved. There was no dust displacement, no sign that it had lain undisturbed for long. It had been placed for discovery, not found by accident. He glanced at the inspector, who was already making preparations to summon Fiona for a formal questioning, ready to declare triumph. Hamish's gaze drifted instead to the subtle details that had seemed inconsequential until now. The faint smear of soot on the fireplace, the condensation streak on the window pane, the delicate scent of lavender lingering faintly in the air. None of these had been addressed in the rush to judgment, and together they whispered a truth the inspector had yet to hear. Fiona arrived promptly, her expression composed, almost rehearsed in its anxious concern. She was eager to answer, quick to acknowledge her financial conversations with Andrew, and willing to admit minor grievances about the pace of her inheritance. The inspector nodded, satisfied, already imagining the headlines: "Motive confirmed. Suspect identified." Yet Hamish observed the small inconsistencies in her demeanour, a flicker of hesitation when asked about the exact time she had left the library, the way her eyes darted toward the fireplace, and the subtle tightening of her jaw when the notebook was mentioned. These were not the marks of guilt over debt alone, they were signs of someone aware that she was being tested, someone gauging how much to reveal. Hamish excused himself, stepping into the hallway where the frost-laden light filtered through the tall windows. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, considering the broader picture. A real killer, he knew, rarely left a single clue pointing so directly at them. The notebook, though damning in appearance, could easily have been staged to draw attention away from the true perpetrator. There was a rhythm to deception, a careful balance between revelation and concealment, and this felt like the first overture of a carefully orchestrated performance. The inspector returned moments later, brimming with triumph. "We've got her," he said proudly, referring to Fiona. "Everything points to her. Financial dispute, opportunity, even the notes she's been trying to cover up. It's resolved." Hamish allowed a polite nod, his expression neutral, though inside a slow, simmering tension took hold. The evidence was too neat, too conveniently located. The murderer had anticipated investigators like the inspector, setting a trap that encouraged a premature declaration of victory. Hamish returned briefly to the drawing-room, crouching near the mantel where the Queen of Hearts still lay, untouched. The card had remained in place, almost impervious to the small storm of attention swirling around it. To him, it no longer seemed a mere symbol. It was a quiet witness, observing how easily humans could be misled when the surface looked convincing enough. Someone was manipulating perception, crafting a narrative that pointed fingers in the wrong direction, while keeping their own movements hidden. As he stepped back, he felt the familiar pull of the real mystery still simmering beneath the polished surface of the household. Fiona might have grievances, might have coveted her inheritance, but she was unlikely to have executed a crime so meticulously staged, so impossibly neat. The true criminal remained in the shadows, patient, careful, knowing that the premature declaration of guilt would lull the household and the authorities into a false sense of security. Hamish could sense the quiet anticipation, the invisible waiting game that played out in the subtle tensions of the house, in the almost imperceptible gestures of its occupants. He exhaled slowly, allowing the tension to settle just enough to focus. The breakthrough the inspector celebrated was illusory, a carefully placed piece in a larger puzzle. The murderer was still at large, hidden behind the masks of grief and propriety, waiting for the perfect moment to test whether their carefully constructed deception would remain intact. Hamish Macbeth understood, with that particular certainty that came from years of patient observation, that the game had only just begun, and the next move would be critical. Hamish Macbeth returned to the study, the room quiet now except for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock, its sound measured, almost accusatory in the stillness. As he moved among the shelves, his eyes roamed over the leather-bound tomes and forgotten ledgers, seeking patterns, discrepancies, anything that might have slipped past the less observant eyes of the authorities. One particular ledger, thick with dust and neglected in a dark corner, caught his attention. The bindings were cracked, the pages yellowed, yet the contents suggested meticulous record-keeping. Accounts of debts, favours and subtle agreements stretching back nearly a decade. Fiona's financial disputes, the notebook, even the careful staging of Andrew's death, suddenly took on new layers when Hamish cross-referenced names in the ledger with family correspondences he had examined days before. A pattern emerged, one that tied not only Fiona but also Mrs. Maclean and the footman to a series of minor, but strangely recurring conflicts involving Andrew's father. There had been disputes over inheritance, property, and long-forgotten obligations, small grievances that seemed trivial at the time but hinted at simmering resentments that had festered beneath the polite veneer of Muirfield House. Hamish traced a particular entry, noting the careful cursive of Andrew's father beside it, a sum owed, never paid, with initials beside the note that matched Mrs. Maclean's handwriting. A subtle connection crystallized. It was not merely Andrew's actions that had stirred these tensions, but a generational ripple of old obligations and perceived slights. Mrs. Maclean, loyal, as she appeared, had been entangled in these debts and favours, her devotion mingled with quiet resentment. The footman, too, had family links that intersected with these old arrangements, connections forgotten by all but those with long memories. He pulled a photograph from the mantelpiece, one showing Andrew's father with a younger Mrs. Maclean and a young Fiona, their postures casual, smiling at some long-ago event. But the photograph also hinted at alliances, subtle gestures and positioning that suggested a closeness not openly acknowledged in the present. This was a household where loyalty, love, and obligation had become entwined in ways no outsider would guess, and where the echoes of past decisions could shape the present with quiet insistence. Hamish considered the Queen of Hearts still lying untouched on the mantel, and realized it might represent more than a whimsical message. Hearts, after all, could symbolize the persistence of old ties, connections hidden beneath decades of propriety. The card's placement, deliberate and serene, now seemed almost like a quiet nod to the entangled past, the reminder that this murder was not born of immediate grievances alone, but had roots reaching back years, threading through loyalty, indebtedness, and unspoken family expectations. His thoughts turned to Mrs. Maclean once more. The tremor in her hands, the avoidance of his gaze, these were not merely signs of anxiety in the moment. They were the residues of old secrets, of compacts made quietly and sometimes unfairly, that had long lain beneath the surface of daily life at Muirfield House. And Fiona, eager to assert herself in the present, might have misjudged the depth of entanglements she had inherited alongside the estate. Even the footman, who appeared peripheral and insignificant, had his own hidden stakes, quietly tied to the unfolding drama by threads of past alien. CEs and debts. Hamish closed the ledger carefully, letting the dust rise in a faint cloud that hung briefly in the pale morning light. He realized that the apparent simplicity of the crime had been an illusion. The meticulous staging, the premature accusations, the carefully planted notebook, all of it made sense when viewed as part of a longer narrative, one that had been decades in the making. The murderer had known these histories, had counted on the patterns of loyalty and resentment to conceal their own involvement. Returning to the hearth, Hamish allowed himself a small, reflective smile. The crime was no longer just an isolated act of greed or passion. It was a culmination of past entanglements, a deliberate manipulation of relationships and memories that had persisted silently through the years. Shadows of the past, long ignored or forgotten, had shaped every motive, every hesitation, every deceptive act in the house. And Hamish Macbeth, patient as ever, could see the faint outlines of the truth beginning to emerge from that long-forgotten history. The present, he understood, could not be disentangled from the past. Only by tracing the faint echoes of old debts, loyalties and resentments could he hope to reveal the person who had orchestrated a murder too polite to notice. Hamish Macbeth lingered in the quiet of the drawing-room, letting the weight of the past and present settle together. The shadows of Muirfield House seemed to lean in with him, almost sentient in their patience. He needed more than observation. He needed a test, something subtle yet revealing, a way to measure the reactions of those who had been polished in their grief, their fear, and their carefully rehearsed statements. Sometimes, he thought, a mind could be unmasked, not by evidence alone, but by the way it perceived itself under pressure. He called Mrs. Maclean back into the room under pretense of examining the hearth more closely. "I've been thinking," he said casually, as if pondering aloud, "about the Queen of Hearts. I wonder, does it mean anything to you? Something personal, perhaps?" He allowed his eyes to rest lightly on hers, saying nothing further, giving her the quiet space to speak. Mrs. Maclean's hands clutched the edge of the mantel, knuckles pale, yet she remained silent, a faint flush creeping into her cheeks. Made no move to press further, letting the silence stretch. People invariably revealed themselves in the spaces between words, and he could feel the tiniest shift in her posture, the slight tremor of her body as if she were balancing the decision to speak or remain silent. Sometimes, he continued, his tone reflective, almost conversational, we leave messages for ourselves in unusual ways, so that later, if anyone finds them, they might understand something we did not intend to share directly. He gestured toward the card. Small signs, reminders of things that matter. Simple to someone who knows how to look. R.S. Maclean's breath caught faintly, and for a fleeting second her eyes darted toward the fireplace, then back to his. There was a flicker, a crack in the polished surface she presented to the world that she could not entirely conceal. I don't understand what you mean," she said finally, voice low, betraying an edge of defensiveness she had not shown before. Etch. Mish nodded, a small, encouraging gesture, then pivoted to the footman. "And you, young man," he said gently, "sometimes a person notices more than they realize. Perhaps you saw something yesterday, something you didn't think was important at the time. Even a minor detail can mean everything in hindsight." The boy's eyes widened slightly, and he shifted in place. Hamish noticed the careful way he placed his hands together, the avoidance of direct eye, contact, and the faint tremor in his voice when he replied, I don't remember anything unusual," yet the hesitation, subtle as it was, suggested otherwise. Then Hamish turned to Fiona, letting his gaze rest lightly on her, as though caught in thought. "You mentioned your time in the library," he said softly. "Curious, isn't it, how memory can be selective? Sometimes the mind prefers certain versions of events over others." Fiona's expression tightened imperceptibly. She pressed her lips together, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of a chair, betraying a nervous rhythm. The subtle repetition of motion was almost invisible to anyone else, but to Hamish it was a telltale sign, stress manifesting as involuntary action, a small crack in the surface of her careful composure. Hamish allowed a moment of silence to pass, letting each person sit with the quiet weight of his words. Then he spoke again, as if to himself, almost gently teasing the air. "It's fascinating, isn't it? How the simplest act, a card left in a place, a smudge on the hearth, can reveal intentions we might otherwise deny. Sometimes the thing meant to mislead is itself the revelation." He observed closely as Fiona's fingers twitched again, more insistently this time, betraying a flicker of internal conflict. Mrs. Maclean's gaze flicked toward the Queen of Hearts once more, her breathing shallow. The footman's eyes, previously downcast, met his for a brief instant before darting away. The test had worked. Not through coercion, nor through evidence alone, but by lightly engaging their awareness, by creating a moment where pretense and reality intersected. Hamish allowed a faint smile to curl on his lips. The unconventional tactic had revealed what the routine questioning could not, a subtle reaction, an involuntary crack in the facade of composure. Somewhere within these responses lay the real story, the true perpetrator's careful mask faltering under the smallest pressure, the first genuine hint of the truth hidden beneath the polite performance of grief and propriety. And as he watched, quietly noting every nuance, he knew he was closer than ever to following the faint trail of deception to its source. Hamish Macbeth had just begun to trace the patterns of subtle reaction, cross-referencing the fleeting gestures of each suspect with the historical entanglements he had uncovered in the ledgers, when a commotion from the hallway drew his attention. A constable burst in, breathless, clutching a small, crumpled envelope. "Sir," he exclaimed, "the notebook, it's gone. We had it here for safekeeping, and now it's vanished, Brr." Hamish's eyes narrowed. The ledger and the notebook had been central to understanding the past entanglements of Muirfield House. Without them, the careful threads he had begun to untangle would fray. The inspector, already prone to impatience, reddened, muttering about negligence and incompetence, calling for the other constables to search the entire house. But Hamish noticed something in the sudden flurry of activity, a tension in the household, a quiet tightening among those who had been present. The theft of evidence was no accident. Someone had anticipated the investigation and had acted to remove a crucial piece before it could expose the full picture. He moved quietly toward the study, retracing the path where the notebook had been kept. The desk drawers were locked, the ledgers in place, but the faint trace of dust, displaced on the floor, suggested movement, careful but deliberate. Someone had been methodical, not reckless, aiming not to draw attention but to create the illusion of chance. Hamish's mind raced, considering who among the household could possess the subtle combination of access, knowledge, and composure to execute such a quiet act. He returned to the drawing room, eyes scanning the Queen of Hearts still perched on the mantel, untouched yet almost mocking in its continued presence. The card, like the vanished notebook, seemed to be part of a careful choreography, a game the perpetrator played to control what others saw and believed. Hamish's gaze swept over the assembled household. Mrs. Maclean's hands were pressed tightly together, her knuckles white. Fiona fidgeted, Fingers curling and uncurling in subtle, nervous patterns, the footman's eyes darted toward the fireplace before quickly lowering again. Each movement spoke volumes, revealing a nervous calculation beneath the surface calm. He asked gently, "Has anyone left the room since the notebook was last secured?" The question, seemingly casual, was aimed to observe reaction rather than elicit truth. Mrs. Maclean's eyes flinched slightly. Fiona's composure faltered just enough for Hamish to note the micro-expression, an almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes, a fraction of hesitation before her polite denial. The footman shuffled, gaze dropping to the floor. The thief, Hamish realized, had misjudged one thing: subtle observation could see what even careful hands tried to hide. The inspector returned with a small group of officers claiming that a search of every nook and cranny had revealed nothing. "It's as if it vanished into thin air," he exclaimed. Hamish's lips twitched, a quiet smile forming. That was exactly the point. The evidence had been removed to mislead them, to create a false trail, to give the murderer a head start in controlling the narrative of the crime. And whoever it was had done so confidently, expecting the authorities to accept their story without scrutiny. Hamish crouched near the hearth, tracing the faint smear of soot he had noticed earlier. The subtle traces of past movements in the room, the smudge, the condensation on the window, the faint scent of lavender, all remained intact, silent witnesses to actions that could not easily be erased. The notebook's disappearance did not erase the truth. It merely raised the stakes, forcing Hamish to rely on the interplay of these smaller overlooked clues and the human reactions they provoked to reconstruct the sequence of events. He allowed himself a slow breath and studied the occupants again, noting the tension in the room, the shifting glances, the calculated politeness. The theft of evidence was a message as much as an act. Someone was watching, someone was clever, and someone believed themselves one step ahead. But Hamish Macbeth had learned to anticipate such manoeuvres, to see beyond the staged performances and the disappearing objects, to trace the intent that lingered in the air. The case had shifted, become sharper, more dangerous. Trust within the household was fragile, every word potentially misleading, every gesture laden with hidden meaning. Hamish could feel the invisible pulse of anticipation from the murderer, waiting for the moment when the confusion and misdirection would have taken hold. But the detective had patience, insight, and an unwavering eye for subtlety. Even without the notebook, the threads of the mystery remained within reach. The real criminal had acted boldly, yet in doing so, had left faint traces that would eventually lead Hamish Macbeth straight to the heart of the secret, no matter how carefully the evidence had been hidden. Hamish Macbeth was standing near the window, tracing the faint condensation streaks that had puzzled him earlier, when a sudden, urgent knock at the front door broke the stillness of Muirfield House. A breathless messenger had arrived from the village. The footman, pale and shaking, had gone missing from the servants' quarters. He hadn't answered the morning calls, and when the staff went to check, the room was empty. Bed unmade, belongings untouched, yet a small brass inkwell had been overturned on the floor, ink still pooling across the polished wood. Hamish's pulse quickened. The disappearance was not random. It followed the removal of the notebook, the carefully staged first murder, and now this, a warning, a challenge, or a calculated move to unsettle the investigation. He glanced around the room, noting the reactions of the household. Mrs. Maclean's lips parted slightly, her fingers tightening over her apron, while Fiona's composed mask flickered, a subtle tremor running along the corners of her mouth. Even the inspector looked momentarily unsettled, though he quickly masked it with officious concern. Hamish moved to the footman's quarters, letting the inspector follow at a safe distance. The room was immaculate except for the overturned inkwell, a faint scent of lavender lingering in the air, a reminder of subtle threads connecting the events of the past days. The window was slightly ajar, a narrow gap just enough to suggest escape, yet the frost outside showed no footprints leading from it. Whoever had taken the boy had done so without leaving any conventional trace, just as the murderer had executed the first crime with impossible precision. He crouched to examine the floor, noting the faintest indentation near the doorway. Too slight for an adult step, almost certainly the passage of someone small and careful. perhaps guided. Hamish's eyes narrowed. The implications were chilling. The perpetrator was not only several moves ahead, but was manipulating the household like pieces on a chessboard, anticipating their reactions, orchestrating disappearances to sow confusion and fear. Returning to the drawing room, he quickly gathered the household for a careful discussion, framing it not as interrogation, but as precaution. "Someone has taken the footman," he said calmly, watching the subtle reactions of those assembled. It was deliberate. Whoever did this wants something. It might be information, it might be leverage, or it might simply be to keep us off balance. He allowed the weight of the statement to settle, observing the shifts in posture, the quiet inhalations, the small avoidance of eye contact. Mrs. Maclean spoke first, voice trembling. I didn't see anything. I was preparing breakfast, and then I realized he was gone." Her eyes flicked toward the window, then toward Fiona. Fiona's reply was swift and measured, almost rehearsed. "I was in the library. I didn't leave my room. I have no idea what you're suggesting." Hamish noted the micro-expression that passed briefly across her face, a flash of impatience, perhaps annoyance, perhaps fear, before her practiced mask returned. Hamish drew a deep breath, his mind racing through possibilities. The disappearance confirmed something he had suspected but could not yet prove. The villain had not been caught, had not been outwitted by the first murder, and was actively manipulating the investigation. The notebook might be gone, the first murder seemingly solved, but this second act was proof that they were dealing with a calculating mind. Someone willing to take risks to maintain control and mislead those who sought the truth. He knew that the investigation had shifted from reconstruction to prevention. Solving the first crime was no longer enough. The priority now was to anticipate the next move, to safeguard potential victims, and to force the criminal into revealing themselves. Hamish began to organize the search carefully, instructing officers to cover predictable paths, while he retraced the subtle, unlikely routes a clever perpetrator might use. Every door, every window, every hidden passage within Muirfield House suddenly became a point of interest. The morning sunlight, weak and diffuse, fell across the polished floors as Hamish paused, hand on the mantel near the Queen of Hearts. The card seemed to mock the unfolding chaos, its serene presence a reminder that the perpetrator played their own quiet game. Hamish's jaw tightened with resolve. The villain was clever, patient, and cruelly precise, but Macbeth had patience of his own. With every subtle gesture, every overlooked detail, and now with the urgency imposed by a second crime, he would draw the murderer out, step by deliberate step. Failure was not an option, not for the footman, not for the household, and certainly not for Hamish Macbeth. The game had shifted, the stakes had risen, and the hunt was now urgent, dangerous, and deeply personal. Hamish Macbeth stood silently in the drawing room, letting the tension of the past hours settle around him like the fog that clung to the hills outside. The footman's disappearance had rattled the household, but it had also sharpened his focus. He retraced every subtle clue, every hesitation, every misdirection that had surfaced since Andrew Bannerman's death. Amid the apparent chaos, a pattern, a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm, was beginning to emerge. He returned to the mantelpiece, eyes lingering on the Queen of He. Arts. For days it had seemed merely a flourish, a whimsical taunt from a murderer confident in their cleverness. But now it struck him differently. The card was always left in view, deliberately, as a signal or marker, positioned in a way that corresponded to the subtle shifts in the household. The micro-movements, the fleeting glances, the inconsistencies he had observed during questioning. The card's placement was less about Andrew, and more about the interactions it provoked, the small reactions it drew from the people who had seen it. It had been a tool, a way to test responses and reveal cracks in the carefully constructed facades. Hamish's eyes drifted to the overturned inkwell in the footman's quarters. A detail dismissed by everyone else as accident or carelessness now seemed deliberate in its timing and placement. The ink formed a small, dark blot, almost insignificant, yet it lay in a position that aligned with the footman's trajectory through the room, and, by extension, the subtle misdirection the murderer had created. Each small disturbance, An ink blot, a smudge of soot, the faint scent of lavender, was not random but a quiet link in a chain, a breadcrumb meant to mislead the inexperienced, while leaving a trail for a careful observer. Hamish's thoughts returned to the ledger and the missing notebook. They had been central pieces, yet their absence had forced him to focus on subtler, more revealing signs, the mannerisms, the hesitations, the involuntary movements. Mrs. Maclean's faint tremor when the Queen of Hearts was mentioned, Fiona's micro-expressions during casual conversation, the footman's nervous shifts, all were now part of the emerging sequence. One could trace the movements and reactions of each person, layer upon layer, until the deliberate orchestration of the crime became clear. E recalled Fiona's insistence that she had been in the library, and the subtle inconsistencies she displayed, the fleeting impatience when asked about precise timings, the careful positioning of her hands, the way she avoided the fireplace. Each of these small actions, initially dismissed as nervousness, now fit into a broader pattern, connecting her to the first murder. Not as the direct perpetrator, perhaps, but as someone entwined in the web of relationships and misjudgments that had allowed the murderer to manipulate the household so effectively. Hamish crouched, examining the faint smudge of soot once more, tracing it along the edge of the hearth. The angle, the texture, the slight displacement. It was a signature, a mark of a person who had moved with exact purpose, who had anticipated scrutiny and yet could not fully erase the evidence of their passage. In combination with the behavioral patterns he had observed, it began to reveal a methodology, a carefully rehearsed orchestration of space, perception, and response designed to mislead all but the most attentive observer. Even the scent of lavender, so easily dismissed, now resonated as part of the pattern. It had accompanied each calculated move, a faint, almost imperceptible marker linking actions across time and place within the house. The killer had relied on subtlety and expectation. No one would think to connect a fading fragrance to motive or timing, yet for Hamish it was a thread weaving the disparate events into coherence. Slowly a smile touched his lips. The pieces were no longer disparate, they were connected, a latticework of intention hidden in plain sight. Every hesitation, every offhand gesture, every tiny anomaly formed a sequence, and the pattern that emerged now pointed unmistakably toward the mind orchestrating it all. The clues had always been there, ignored or overlooked by the hurried, by the anxious, by those eager for premature closure, but Hamish had seen them. He straightened, eyes sweeping the room and the assembled household. The pattern was clear, the framework of the crime, now revealed in its quiet elegance. And within that pattern lay the next step, the opportunity to confront the perpetrator before more damage could be done, to prevent further chaos, and to finally unravel the carefully hidden design behind a murder too polite to notice. Hamish Macbeth lingered in the drawing-room, the patterns of small gestures, subtle smudges, and carefully staged details now forming a coherent lattice in his mind. He allowed the household to settle into a semblance of calm, while quietly observing, listening, and tracing the invisible lines that linked each individual to Andrew Bannerman's death. Each movement, each hesitant glance, each involuntary twitch had guided him to a deeper understanding, and now he felt the final pieces shifting into place. He returned to Mrs. Maclean first, speaking gently as if continuing a casual conversation rather than interrogation. "You've served this household for a long time," he said, letting his tone carry no accusation. "You've seen tempers flare, favours withheld, loyalties shift. Tell me, when did you first notice tension? Anything that seemed out of place with Andrew's behaviour?" She stiffened, glancing toward Fiona, then down at her clasped hands. There was a pause, a trembling exhalation. It was years ago," she whispered. "Long before Andrew inherited the estate. There were promises, things hidden, debts, and then the letters. I saw things I shouldn't have." Hamish allowed the words to settle. There it was, an old grievance, a compounding of fear, duty, and resentment that had been carefully buried beneath decades of polite conduct. But he sensed she had not yet revealed the full scope. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "And those debts, promises. They were not just financial, were they? They were personal, binding you, binding someone else, in ways that could not be ignored. Her eyes flicked sharply to Fiona, and then back, narrowing with a mixture of defiance and fear. It wasn't just money, she admitted. It was protection and shame. Some things must never be exposed. Some truths cannot be allowed to continue. Hamish's thoughts returned to the footman's disappearance, the stolen notebook, and the careful staging of Andrew's murder, the threads that had seemed disparate, the financial disputes, the tremors of nervousness. The misplaced card now formed a terrifyingly intimate picture. The crime was not motivated by greed alone. It was about controlling secrets, ensuring silence, and preserving reputations. The villain had acted not just to benefit, but to bury a past that could destroy lives if revealed. He turned his attention to Fiona, who had remained still, her composed mask slowly fracturing under the weight of his patient observation. "Fiona," he said softly, "the ledger, the notebook, even Andrew's own reactions. They were all connected to more than money. They were connected to a truth someone feared would come to light. You understood the stakes, didn't you?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, a shiver passing across her hands as they gripped the edge of the chair. "Yes," she admitted finally, voice low but steady. Andrew, he discovered something about the past, about what had been kept from him. He confronted me, or tried to, and I couldn't let it happen. The house, the family, everything we had built. I thought I could control it. I thought I could keep it quiet." Her eyes glistened, but they were not tears of grief alone. They were the reflection of a mind driven by desperation, guilt, and fear, willing to go to extremes to protect a fragile order. Hamish nodded slowly, understanding settling over him. Like the soft mists along the loch, this was no ordinary crime of opportunity or resentment. It was an act born of psychological pressure, a compulsion rooted in obsession with control and secrecy. The villain's careful orchestration, the staged evidence, the vanished notebook, the calculated disappearances, was an attempt to manage not just perception but memory itself, to dictate what could and could not be revealed. The murder, the manipulations, the fear-inducing acts, they were all components of a single desperate desire to suppress a past that threatened to unravel the present. He allowed himself a moment of reflection, noting the subtle details around the room, the Queen of Hearts, still perched in serene observation, the faint smudges, the lingering scent of lavender, all elements in a grand psychological design, each chosen to manipulate attention and conceal the depth of motive. What had appeared as politeness and meticulousness was, in truth, a window into a troubled psyche, a mind willing to orchestrate life and death, to preserve the fragile equilibrium of secrets. Hamish straightened, letting his gaze sweep over the household, now tense and silent. The revelation of the true motive transformed the investigation. It was no longer merely a matter of identifying opportunity or financial temptation. It was a matter of understanding a human mind pushed to extremes, a mind that had turned fear, loyalty, and obsession into a lethal calculus. And with that understanding, Macbeth knew the final unravelling could begin, not only to bring the murderer to justice, but to expose the fragile, dangerous psychology that had guided every deliberate step of the crime. Hamish Macbeth moved deliberately through the corridors of Muirfield House, the muted creak of his boots on the polished floors the only sound accompanying his thoughts. The household had grown quiet under the weight of recent revelations, the tension palpable, each person aware that the net of scrutiny was tightening. He had traced the pattern, understood the hidden motives, and now it was time for the final step, to confront the mind that had orchestrated such careful deception. He returned to the drawing room, where the familiar Queen of Hearts sat untouched, a silent sentinel to the drama that had unfolded. Mrs. Maclean and Fiona were present, as well as the inspector, whose impatience simmered beneath a polite exterior. Hamish allowed the room to settle into a tense stillness before speaking, his voice calm, steady, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "We've traced the pattern," he said softly, letting each word sink in. "We understand the motives, the movements, and the small clues left to test our attention. And now it is time to reveal the truth, Barbara. Iona shifted, her composure fraying imperceptibly. Mrs. MacLean's hands trembled slightly, but she remained seated, her eyes fixed on Hamish. The detective's gaze swept the room, noting every reaction, the flicker of fear, the avoidance of eye contact, the tension coiling in shoulders and hands. These were the final cracks, the signs that he had anticipated. Hamish stepped closer to the mantel, letting his eyes rest on the Queen of Hearts, then back to the assembled household. The first crime was staged with precision, designed to mislead. Evidence was moved, appearances manipulated, reactions tested. The disappearance of the footman, the stolen notebook, all were part of the same orchestration. And the motive, it was never mere greed or impatience, it was fear. Fear of the past being revealed, fear of the consequences, fear that certain truths could destroy everything. But fear alone cannot conceal action forever. Iona's hands curled in her lap, knuckles whitening. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Swallow. Wing hard. Hamish allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of observation press in. You wanted to control the story, he said quietly, to manage what could be seen, what could be known. Every gesture, every subtle manipulation, every act of misdirection. It was all meant to protect something you feared. Her composure cracked, a subtle tremor running through her body. I didn't mean, she stammered, voice shaking. I only wanted to stop it. He would have ruined everything. The desperation in her tone confirmed what Hamish had suspected. The crime was a product of psychological pressure, a culmination of obsession with control and secrecy. Hamish took a measured step forward, eyes never leaving hers. And in that fear, he said calmly, you took steps that could not be undone. Andrew is dead, evidence has vanished, the footman was endangered, but now the consequences are yours to face. He let the words settle, the room holding its breath. Fiona's eyes widened, panic flickering. She made a sudden move toward the door, a last desperate attempt to flee. Hamish was already a step ahead. He intercepted her with a firm but non-violent grip, guiding her back into the center of the room. It ends here, he said quietly but firmly. There is nowhere to run. Every action, every choice has led to this moment. You are not above consequence. The inspector moved forward, but Hamish raised a hand to stay him. The confession needed no theatrics, it needed recognition, acceptance of the truth, the release of denial. Fiona's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving her as reality took hold. She sank into the nearest chair, trembling, finally acknowledging the weight of what had been done. Mrs. MacLean exhaled, tension bleeding from her posture, as if a long-held burden could finally rest. The footman's absence no longer held the same dread, the immediate threat having passed. Hamish stepped back, letting the room absorb the moment, every subtle detail. The Queen of Hearts, the lingering scent of lavender, the faint smudges on the hearth, coming together as witnesses to the unravelling. In that stillness, Hamish Macbeth allowed himself a quiet sense of satisfaction. The pattern had emerged, the hidden motives revealed, and the villain confronted. Every small clue, every involuntary gesture, every misdirection had led to this precise moment. The household, though scarred by fear and deception, would now begin to recover, guided by the truth. And Hamish, patient and observant as ever, knew that justice had been served, not through haste but through attention, understanding, and an unwavering eye for the details that most overlooked. Hamish Macbeth allowed the tension in the drawing-room to settle, the confession having seemingly resolved the case. Fiona sat pale and trembling, Mrs. MacLean's posture slack with relief, and even the inspector had relaxed into the satisfaction of closure. For a moment, the household exhaled as if the oppressive weight of uncertainty had lifted, and Hamish let himself savour the faint sense of accomplishment. But instinct, honed over years of observing human behaviour, kept him alert, his eyes flicking over the room, noting every subtle detail, every movement too deliberate or too still. He returned his gaze to the mantelpiece, lingering once more on the Queen of Hearts. It had been a constant throughout the investigation, a silent observer, a provocateur, and something about its presence now struck him differently. Not the card itself, but the placement and timing of its appearances, too precise, too consistent. He remembered the slight hesitation of Mrs. Maclean when it was first mentioned, the micro-expression Fiona had shown, and the footman's brief, nervous glance. Each had been interpreted in isolation. B.U. Now a troubling thought began to form. What if the real manipulator had been operating in the background, orchestrating events while letting others act as decoys? He moved quietly to the desk where the ledger had once lain, running his fingers over the polished wood, noting faint impressions, as though someone had tried to erase traces but had missed subtle indents. Then a recollection struck him. The day of Andrew's murder. A brief moment when the inspector had suggested the first person to be questioned. The suggestion had seemed routine, procedural, harmless. But now, in light of the emerging pattern and psychological orchestration, Hamish recalled the tone, the timing, the almost imperceptible insistence. He turned sharply to the inspector, who met his gaze with a mix of surprise and confusion. "Inspector," Hamish said quietly, letting the word settle. "Tell me again exactly how the first witness was chosen to be interviewed." The inspector's brow furrowed, memory flickering. Well, it seemed the most straightforward course," he said cautiously. "I thought it best to start with someone with proximity to the event." Hamish nodded slowly, masking the sudden acceleration of his thoughts. Then it clicked, the sequence of events, the subtle redirections, the way the notebook had vanished, the staged reactions, all had followed a pattern that could have been predicted and manipulated from within the very team investigating the case. The careful orchestration, the timing of confessions, even the apparent panic of Fiona and the household had all served a larger purpose, to draw attention to the wrong people, to create a false resolution while the real mastermind remained in plain sight. Hamish allowed himself a measured step back, considering the implications. The genius of the orchestration was in its audacity. Someone had been several moves ahead all along. Exploitee, NG human expectation, authority and trust to guide the investigation exactly where they wanted. The final piece of evidence, the missing ledger entries, the overlooked habits, the timing of each subtle gesture, began to converge toward a single, unsettling truth. The mastermind was not Fiona, not Mrs. Maclean, and not even the seemingly peripheral footman. It was someone who had the knowledge, the authority, and the ability to manipulate the investigation itself. The inspector. Hamish's pulse remained calm, his exterior composed, but his mind raced, mapping contingencies, anticipating potential reactions. He observed the inspector carefully, noting the subtle tightening of the jaw, the slight flush across the cheeks, the momentary glance toward the Queen of Hearts on the mantel. The card, so often overlooked, had been a signal, a deliberate tool used to test reactions, placed in view to measure response. Every step had been calculated to mislead, to conceal the truth in plain sight. E allowed the room to feel the pause, the quiet weight of thought pressing against the tension. Then, in a controlled, deliberate tone, Hamish addressed the inspector. "It seems the game was more intricate than any of us imagined. Every movement, every suggestion, every staged discovery, it all points to someone guiding the hand of this investigation from within." The inspector's eyes widened, his composure faltering for a fleeting moment as the realization, and fear, took hold. And in that instant, Hamish Macbeth knew the final confrontation was about to begin. The case that had seemed resolved, that had given the household a fragile sense of closure, was far from over. The real mastermind had been hiding in plain sight, orchestrating every detail, and now the detective faced the ultimate test, to outwit the cleverest mind in the room, reveal the truth, and prevent any further manipulations or tragedies before the carefully constructed deception could claim another victim. Hamish Macbeth stepped closer to the inspector, whose usual air of authority now wavered under the weight of unspoken accusation. The room was taut with tension. Mrs. Maclean clutched her hands together, Fiona sat rigid, and the footman had returned quietly from his quarters, eyes wide with apprehension. Every person present felt the shift, The realization that the neatly solved case was, in fact, far more intricate than any of them had imagined. Hamish's voice was calm, deliberate, carrying a weight that drew every eye in the room. The notebook, the ledger, even the Queen of Hearts, they were all part of the same design, he said, letting his gaze rest on the inspector. And yet the real orchestrator hid in plain sight. Every step of this investigation has been influenced, every reaction observed, every piece of evidence staged or manipulated. He paused, allowing the statement to sink in. The missing footman, the false leads, the confession of Fiona, they were all carefully engineered diversions meant to protect the true culprit from scrutiny. The inspector's face paled, lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. Hamish continued methodically, tracing the chain of subtle manipulations. The timing of witness interviews, the selection of questions, the emphasis placed on certain observations, all consistent with someone who knew the investigation intimately, and only someone within the system could have anticipated and guided every response so precisely. E gestured toward the mantelpiece, where the Queen of Hearts remained, serene and almost mocking. Even this card was more than a trinket. It was a psychological tool, placed to provoke reactions, to test behaviors, to observe who would falter and who would not. The small details, the tremors, the hesitations, the micro-expressio, we noticed over the past days, were not accidents. They were indicators, markers that guided the investigation's flow. And yet, all of it pointed back to one person who had skillfully remained beyond suspicion. Until now. The inspector swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. Hamish's eyes were steady, unwavering. "You see," he said softly, "it is not always the obvious actions or the grand gestures that reveal intent. It is in the subtleties, the overlooked hesitation, the brief glance, the choice to emphasize or omit information. That is why this investigation has taken time, patience, and a careful eye, and why the truth has finally become clear." For a moment, silence enveloped the room. The inspector made a sudden movement toward the door, a desperate, instinctive attempt to escape the impending consequences. But Hamish, anticipating the motion, stepped decisively in front, blocking the path with a quiet authority that left no room for argument. "There is nowhere to run," Hamish said, voice even, controlled. "Every movement has already been observed, every action accounted for. The game is finished." The inspector froze, shoulders slackening, a reluctant acknowledgement of defeat in his posture. Then, with a measured exhale, he allowed himself to be guided toward the drawing-room chairs. Hamish explained patiently the overlooked cues, the subtle shifts in reaction during questioning, the careful orchestration of the notebook's disappearance, the orchestrated panic of the household, and the misdirection embedded in the ledger and Queen of Hearts. Each was a breadcrumb leading to the realization that the person they had trusted implicitly was, in fact, the architect of chaos. Fiona, Mrs. MacLean, and the footman listened, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and relief, as the detective mapped out the concealed design. Every minor detail, previously dismissed or misunderstood, now coalesced into a complete picture. The true villain had been manipulating both the crime and the investigation, relying on the assumptions of others, the natural deference to authority, and the distractions created by staged evidence. And yet, even as justice was now firmly in sight, Hamish could not ignore the lingering unease. The inspector's cunning, the subtlety of the manipulations, the sheer audacity of using the investigation itself as camouflage, all left a faint shadow in the mind. While the legal system would now deal with the offender, the delicate threads of psychological mastery hinted at the potential for future schemes, a reminder that the clever and patient mind might yet find ways to slip between the cracks. Hamish stepped back, surveying the room one final time. The truth had been revealed, the case solved, and yet the sense of unfinished business remained, an almost imperceptible tension in the air. He allowed a faint smile, acknowledging both victory and caution. Every clue, every hesitation, every subtle reaction had been observed, traced, and interpreted, proving once again why he remained a step ahead of both criminals and the ordinary assumptions that bound others. Justice had been served, yes, but in the quiet, persistent shadow of human cunning, Hamish Macbeth knew that vigilance, patience, and attention to detail would always be necessary. The case was closed, but the lessons it left behind would linger far longer than the moment of triumph. Hamish Macbeth stepped into the chill evening air outside Muirfield House, the faint mist rolling over the hills like a soft, lingering memory. The household behind him had settled into a tentative calm, the inspector now restrained, the footman safe, and Fiona and Mrs. Mac lean quietly processing the revelation that had upended their assumptions. Justice had been delivered, or at least a P. Read to have been, but Hamish's mind was rarely content with appearances alone. He walked slowly down the gravel path, his boots crunching faintly, eyes scanning the familiar contours of the village, the loch shimmering dimly in the waning light. The case had been intricate, layered with psychological nuance and subtle misdirection, and though he had untangled the threads, there remained a small residue of unease. A detail here, a fleeting glance there, nothing overt, nothing obvious, but enough to make him pause. The Queen of Hearts, left behind on the mantel as if to mock the resolution, now haunted his thoughts. Its serene presence was a reminder that in every crime, no matter how thoroughly observed, there were always elements left unseen, corners that could hide another truth. As he crossed the little bridge that arched over the gently flowing river, his mind traced the events of the past days in precise sequence: Andrew Bannerman's murder, the vanished notebook, the manipulated confessions, the orchestrated disappearances. Each step had required patience, observation, and a willingness to trust the subtle cues of human behavior. And yet, he couldn't shake the sense that one last element had slipped through unnoticed. A minor discrepancy in timing, an unremarked shadow in a photograph, a phrase in a ledger entry that had seemed insignificant at first glance. He paused, eyes narrowing as he considered the footman's disappearance. It had been orchestrated so carefully that it had initially seemed random. Yet now, even with the mastermind exposed, Hamish felt the faint pull of something unsaid, a ripple in the sequence that suggested a lingering presence, an echo of manipulation that had not been entirely resolved. Perhaps it was merely the residual effect of the villain's ingenuity, or perhaps it was something more, a subtle warning, a message, or an opening that had B. N left for the clever enough to notice. The evening grew colder, mist curling around the hills, and Hamish pulled his coat tighter. As he passed the edge of the village green, he spotted a scrap of paper fluttering against the post of a lamp. Stooping, he picked it up carefully, noting the faint smudge of ink and a single cryptic line: "Even the careful eye can miss what chooses to hide." He frowned, recognizing the signature flourish of someone who knew the limits of observation, someone who delighted in subtlety and challenge. It was a reminder that while the immediate danger had passed, the mind behind these events was far from ordinary, and the potential for future mischief remained. He tucked the note into his coat pocket and continued walking, the village quiet except for the occasional call of a distant bird and the whisper of the wind across the loch. The resolution of the case had been satisfying, the truth revealed, and the household protected from immediate harm. Yet, Hamish knew that mysteries, by their nature, were never truly complete. Human behavior was unpredictable, secrets persisted, and those clever enough to exploit the shadows could always create new puzzles. By the time he reached the edge of the forest that bordered the village, the moon had risen, casting pale light across the frost-kissed earth. Hamish stopped, surveying the familiar landscape, and allowed himself a faint, wry smile. Another day, another case, another dance with deception and subtlety. The world was full of patterns, of signals hidden in plain sight, of truths that only patience and attention could reveal. With a final glance over his shoulder at Muirfield House, he adjusted his coat and continued on his solitary path. The immediate danger had passed, but the lingering question, the faintest hint that some detail had yet to be fully understood, remained. A mystery never ends, Hamish reflected, not truly. There was always another pattern to discern, another truth to uncover, another subtle human flaw to exploit or protect, and in that understanding he found both satisfaction and anticipation, ready for whatever the next case might bring, confident that he would always notice what others overlooked. The mist closed behind him as he walked into the night, leaving Muirfield House bathed in moonlight, its secrets now partially revealed, its future uncertain, and the shadow of mystery forever lingering in the quiet Scottish hills.